Boom, what's up, everybody? Got Aaron Tillman on. Super pumped to have the conversation. Like always, I feel like I gotta hit record faster before we get rolling because I'm like, oh, these are the good stories. But before we get kicked off, what's a wild, funny story? And then we'll just deep dive in.
Ryan, man, I'm so happy to be with you. I got some crazy stories. I'll say like childhood impacts us in everything that we do. And I got a story. We've all been in like elementary school, K through 12, wildness and the craziness of what we experienced there. And man, let me tell you, so it was Halloween during my time in like fourth or fifth grade.
Yeah.
And we're all passing out candy. There's a fly in class, and everyone's trying to like kill the fly. We're all swatting, going and whatnot. I'm like somewhat athletic in my fourth or fifth grade
My
body.
prime,
I think
yeah.
we got this, right? So I have a Tootsie Roll, and I pull out a Tootsie Roll out of like one of the bags that one of the kids had given me. No lie, threw the Tootsie Roll, hit the fly, and killed the fly in class. So I got some ninja skills a little bit. Just
Yeah,
I'm weird.
yeah. What's funny though is actually I didn't believe people could like kill flies with their hands, and like my wife is like a real life ninja. She just pop 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 pop. Like I don't know how she does it. Literally.
I
I,
love that.
I love it, man. All right. So one thing that like I like so I guess stalking you before the conversation, right? Like, and I noticed that I guess it was a publication that you had done, and one of the things that like I guess I wanted to ask you about a little bit is one of the publications was like life. It talked about there was a life changing moment for you, kind of like your freshman year that like led you to your faith and things like that. And so I'm curious if you don't mind sharing kind of like that life changing like moment because I think for me, I think a lot of those painful moments in our life are what like draw us into like what we're doing to be able to provide people pleasure around us, whether it's athletes, our careers, and things like that. So yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, man. Going back to my freshman year, it was really wild. I had gotten a scholarship to be in the band at Florida A&M University, FAMU, into the Marching 100, which is one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious band in the South when you think about
Yeah,
this band. So I was grateful to have that. Came during my summer year, and in marching, it's similar to sports. Like when you are good at your sport, especially through like middle school, high school, whatever it may be, and you get into college, everybody's excellent at what they do.
yeah.
And I got into this environment where there were just elite musicians everywhere. And I felt like the intimidation of that, but I also did not know the marching style. So we're out there
Mm,
marching. It gets toward the end of the summer, probably closer to August when it's like 90 million degrees in Tallahassee.
yeah, yeah.
And we're out there on the field, and I never forget, man. I just remember like looking up to the sky, and I felt myself like literally passing out on the field because we had been marching so hard, and like the heat was just so bad. And in that moment, and I feel like we all sometimes come to a moment where like life kind of grips us, or we get to this aspect of like we are giving ourselves so much to whatever it is that we don't even realize what we're doing until our body tells us no. And I got to that moment where my body was just gave up on me and I literally like passed out on the field. And in that moment, I felt like God spoke to me. And I felt like what he was saying was like, you're suffering, but you're suffering for things that you think you love, you know?
Mm,
And in that moment, that was a moment where I had to really think about like who I was and what my identity was in not only like being a musician, but also who I was holistically. So in the midst of all of that, there was a lot of hazing that was happening in the band at the time too. And unfortunately, I was a product of that. So I had, moments where, whether it was me like playing the cymbals and like we have to play the cymbals until like they had told us to stop, or, we might be playing the snare drum and someone might come by and like hit us with a stick or whatever it may be, doing push-ups until we couldn't do push-ups anymore and falling downstairs. Like, I mean, I'd been hazed to every single degree, to the point where that suffering, that sort of suffering
right.
stinks, but it produces something inside of us in hopes that we're not being, we're not at the mercy of other people doing it to us, but if we're suffering, we can share with somebody else who might be going through the same thing. So for me, I was at a point where I just was ready to go, and I didn't want to continue to subject myself to what people were putting me through, and I felt like God was calling me to something different. So I left the band. That was probably the greatest and worst decision I could have
Yeah.
made. And I was ridiculed. I was on campus and I was like the ugly cousin who couldn't stick it through and couldn't do it. So I faced a lot of like just insecurity with myself as a freshman in college, and a lot of things that I had to reconcile and see what my other identities were and understand my true value, which was not the skills and the gifts that I had been given, but it was the purpose of what community I was supposed to be in.
So how do you so like identity is my jam, right? Like I think that's like the rabbit hole we could go down like for forever. And so I guess how did you take a step back and ask yourself those like difficult questions? Because I think like that's literally in a certain way like kind of the same scenario like I went through a little bit like through college is just simply like an identity crisis, right? Like it's the I would call it the simplest yet most difficult question to answer is who am I, right? Like, and
Mm-hmm.
once you ask somebody that, they're like, well, that's a stupid question. I'm like, well, like, what do you have? And it's very surface level and generic, your name, your grade, your age, your sport. If you get real wild and crazy, it's a dog or a cat, right? Like that's about as wild as we get within our identity. And so it's like, I guess like what were the things that you started to uncover there? And then how did that lead you? Because I'm making a little bit of an assumption here, but like what you're doing now is that's a piece of the puzzle as well as like helping people uncover those that same question.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing question, and I think I got involved in the community. It's so funny, you know, pain has a way of making you hurt for the time in it being, but it also has a way of like opening you up to a perspective that you may not have thought about before. So it has a way of like widening your lens. And I had a community of individuals while I was on campus when I left the Marching 100, between people that I lived with in my dorm, people that were within the community with one of the campus ministries I was a part of, as well as just like other groups of people who were always like challenging me to think a little bit deeper. And I
Hmm.
felt like I was always a deep thinker. My wife just beats me up about it all day. She's like, look, why do you got to ask such deep questions? Do we have to have this conversation right now? Like, you got to ask these, these really, really deep, you know, can we just stay here today? You
Yeah,
know, so
yeah,
it
yeah.
just, yeah, like, no, we can't stay here. So, so I feel like that, you know, that community that I was around always challenged me to think deeper. And I think what you said is key. Like, it's easy to say, this is where I'm from, this is my name, this is how many siblings I have and stuff like that. But it's really hard to get underneath the surface and really talk about like, what are your motives? What is your intent? You know, what are your beliefs? What are your values? And why do you value those things? I feel like we don't ever healthily question why we believe what we believe, you know? And we will stay in this place of like, I just believe it because somebody told it to me, but we don't ever like bombard it with a series of questions that could actually help us uncover more.
It's like I think that's if I could sum up everything that like I'm doing with athletes now, it is that is to understand where your beliefs come from
Mhm.
because they were at one point in time they were never your beliefs. It was
Right.
something somebody told you. And so it's like it's just fascinating like the older that I've gotten and like the wiser if we want to call it that, right? Like is like that was never my belief. It was just something a teacher, a coach, somebody in the church, somebody at school, somebody in our sports, a parent, a friend's parent. It was a well-intended person that just told us something long enough that we just adopted, right? It's I always say it's like because I use the faith example a lot. If I say like, why is it that you believe in God? And your answer is like, well, I just grew up in the church. Like, that's a really poor answer. That's a
Right,
really
right.
poor answer
Yeah.
to have, right? It's like, because that's just the way my parents raised me,
Right,
right?
right.
And so I'm curious too, it's like, is that part of like what you're doing now too, in terms of like challenging the young adults, if you will, like around you of like I almost say question everything, right? Like
That- that's a good approach, man. I mean, and yes, like the student athletes that I work with day in and day out. I mean, just friends, my community. Um, I ask, you know, I'm not afraid to ask the question to help them really get clarity about what they believe because we have to get really, really, really clear about like who we are, and the way we do that is by looking at what we believe, but also like why we believe what we believe, or how did we become this person. Like, it didn't just like you said, like someone told you something and you didn't just like osmosis, like it became yours, but you adopted this is something that you worked through and you kind of took on as your own. So when I work with our student athletes day in and day out, it can be conversations of faith, it can be conversations of like values, it can be conversations of work. Heck, we talk about career and what that looks
Hmm.
like in the US and like Western Eurocentric culture, as opposed to like you go somewhere else, it looks different, and
Yeah.
we talk about like what those differences are. Or if they just want to come in and talk about like something bad that's happening in their lives, we really try to create a space where they can share just about anything that they want to with us, and we try to help them navigate. We don't claim to be experts at every single subject, but
Right,
if we
right.
can listen well, and if we can come alongside them to at least get them to the right place, I think that's key. And for me, like I have training in it, with my master's being in counseling and human systems. So counseling is my jam, being able to like
Yeah.
help people navigate and get to the root, as my pastor would say, we'll go 7 levels deep, to the basement. Not many people want to go to the basement because it's scary.
Yeah.
It's scary, but that's where you got to go to really like uncover some of this stuff.
Yeah. And it's at one of actually my first mentor and longest mentor, it's like she talks about like going to the root. And I'm curious your opinion on this, because as she helped me uncover oftentimes at the root is it's a feeling of unworthiness, and it's a feeling that we don't deserve X, Y, and Z. It could be a career, it could be a relationship, it could just be an amount of money, right? That like,
Mhm.
it's like if X, Y, and Z is making, $50,000 and they offer you 40, is like the ability to speak. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like we offer the same value. What's the difference? It's the ability to speak up and know your worth. And I feel like
Mm.
that's such a hurdle for people to be able to look in the mirror and genuinely know. It's like sometimes I'm sure you experience this all the time too. It's like telling out, I'm like, if y'all saw what I saw, like, oh my God.
Man, like you were getting at something, like just this reality of unworthiness, because there's also this aspect behind the unworthiness is the shame. So it's
Mm,
like underneath the fact that we feel unworthy is this idea of shame that we are not ever deserving of anything because of the the issues that we brought into the world, or the issues that we brought into our relationships. So there's this idea that we can never make it right again. So why even try? Why even do it? We're always going to be, like you said, unworthy. Or we're always going to be in a place where like our shame is our main motivator for all of our decisions. And then we get ourselves stuck in a rut, in this like pendulum of like, I hate myself. Sometimes I love myself. We don't know like which way to go.
yeah, yeah. And and then I say too, they spend at least 51% or more of the time on the unwanted side, the shame,
Oh
the
yeah.
guilt, the unworthy, right? And so I think part of that too is helping them understand, because they want to like, so I call it like two different worlds, right? And like we have to have like a contrast of those worlds and what they look like. So we can call them, one of the analogies I typically use is like chaos and confidence, right? And we describe what like a world of chaos looks like, and we describe what a world of confidence looks like. But we have to like pull those apart to
Mm,
know which world we're living in, because for most people they just overlap, and it's like, how was your day? And it's like, all right. And they don't really know, right? Because
yeah.
just it that world of chaos and confidence, or I call it victim and creator, um
Mhm.
just overlaps so much. And so it's getting them to understand that, like, hey, we only have to live in this world, we just got to tip the scales, right? 51%, we don't have to be perfect, right? They always ask me like, but what if you come back to this world? I'm like, that's called being a human, like.
That's called reality, right?
Yeah,
Like where we live, you can be in it if you want to. You don't have to, but
yeah,
for most
yeah.
people live.
I'm curious, going back a little bit to, I guess, faith a little bit, and like, and in that moment, was faith, God, religion, whatever, spirituality, whatever we want to call it, prior to that moment, was that a large part of your life or no?
So wildly enough, like as a kid, I was like in and out of like being involved in a church. I had, understood the reality of Jesus's sacrifice for me as a
Right.
child, and it knew what salvation was, all these things, these concepts spiritually that exist, but I had never taken ownership of them
Mm,
myself and like actually sought to understand like why this is so important to me. So I've always believed, but my lifestyle never really like patterned my beliefs. It was just something that I kind of held like we, very nominally, mostly like we'll just kind of hold on to something because, like you said, someone said it, hoorah, there was a poster out on the middle of the street. And I was like,
yeah.
yeah, the poster is legit. Let me follow that, all those things. So I think I held on to it a lot as a kid, and I'd go to a friend's church. I'd be in and out of other people's churches, but it was never like something that I took on as my own. And I would say like probably more so in high schools when it became more real to me. My sister was like getting more involved, and she had told me about her relationship, with God and what that was like. And I'm like, man, God wants a relationship with us. You talk to this guy that does he
Talk
talk back
to
to you?
him.
Does he talk back?
Did you phone call? Like,
Who you talking about? So she would tell me about these things, and she would like do these things where we would read together and kind of talk about like what we learned. So that really built the foundation for me going into college, but it was still something I had to navigate when I got into college because I didn't know that I'd be able to find a community. I felt very like
mhm.
alone being from Colorado, coming all the way to Tallahassee and feeling like just like I'm already lost into myself. This is a culture shock.
Yeah.
But, coming into even a greater place of like, am I going to be able to find a community of people that, maybe share some of the values that I have and or, can I befriend anyone who can help support me and we can support each other as we go through this. So
Yeah. How prevalent do you think it is people talking the talk but not walking the walk? I think that's like one of the biggest hurdles for me with, we can call it religion, faith, spirituality,
mhm.
whatever term we want to use, is there's so many people. It's like we shouldn't judge, but you say cuss words, so I can hang out with you and this and that. And I'm just like, wait a minute, right? Like it's, I don't know. Is in your experience is especially if like it was became much more of a thing like in high school. It's like you've walked the walk, at least from the little that we've known each other, right? Like from that point, like up until now, which is, I would say, rare. And so I'm curious, is that kind of your experience too in when you have conversations with people about faith and religion? Is it like, hey, like this can't be like something that we talk about for an hour and then that's it? Like it's like you have to be it, right? Like you have to actually live it. And I think that that's been a struggle for me
Mm,
personally. And I can share some stories too of like um for instance, I'll give you a story, right? And I'll give you a foundation. I don't know that I've ever shared the story publicly. Went to Christmas service. This was, oh, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago. I'm not really sure. Anyways, this is my family. We were saving a seat for my older sister and her husband, and they had one kid at the time. Their car broke down. They're like they were running late. Long story short, right? They were running late. So
yeah, yeah,
service was getting going. Usher brings down like two people to sit, and we're like, hey, like we're saving these seats. Like there's two adults and a child, blah, blah, blah. I'll cut to the chase. The usher was like, no, these are for them. Like literally, like their car broke down. They're running a little bit late. And I quote from the usher in church, if they don't, it, or I'm sorry, if they can't get here on time, they don't deserve to be here. And I was like, I don't know that I'm coming back here.
yeah. This is probably not the place for us.
Right. And so it's like, I feel like maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm attracting this, unfortunately. Right.
You're
Like,
attracting the misfortune.
yeah, yeah, like the bad people, the bad like faces of the church, right? But
Man,
I'm curious in your experience of like, is that something that you really have to make a point of? Because that's been like the biggest hurdle for me personally.
man, Ryan, this is good. What's the basis, right? The basis, whether people want to accept it or not, is that we are broken. Like we're broken and we try to fix ourselves. And I think the reality of it too is like we desire perfection to be in this way of like human flourishing. So when we see examples of like what you experience where this dude is like, man, this is a church. Like you telling people they gotta be like, even if they're experiencing the worst situation that they could be, you telling them they're you're accusing them that man, they should be here on time. Did you not just hear what I said? That their car is having issues, all these things. So it's like, how do we navigate the world the way that Jesus did, where he wasn't condemning people, but he also wasn't condoning the
Mm,
way that they were living. So he lived in this like
I
paradigm
like
and
that.
this shift of like, how can I immerse myself and live with them and build relationship with them? But how can I also be in a place where I'm not afraid to tell them the truth, you know?
Hmm.
And it's the truth that literally will set them free, that they're
Right.
holding on to this thing that is helping them to feel like they are free, but it's really constraining their lives. And he openly talked to people. He built rapport with them, but it wasn't his rapport didn't excuse his accountability to their lives. So it was to a point where like I think about that, like how do we actively do that same thing in people's lives where we're building relationship, and at some point in any relationship, right? And that's people's fear, is like people are afraid to be honest with each other because no one wants to get their feelings hurt. So what do? You bounce around from talk to talk and you're saying all these things and you're just playing the game of protecting feelings as opposed to actually talking about like what you feel and what's going on in your heart. And that's the cool thing about Jesus, is like, yo, he's like, cut, like, take off the mask.
Yeah.
Take off
Yeah.
the mask, let's get underneath that hood and see like what's really going on underneath there, and really talk deep about it. So I think as we learn to do that well, learn to communicate in a way where it's conducive, but it's also not shielding what you really feel. I think we can see people start to come to see the reality of themselves. And I don't think we do it to the motive of like we want to make sure like we're doing this so that they change, but we do
Right.
it in a sense of like we know the value of just being free and being able to just live in a way where we're not like feeling pulled by perceptions, or that we're living to meet someone else's expectation when we can barely meet our own.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of it too, like when you talk about kind of touching on like communication too, is because you see it in sports as well too, right? Like
Yeah.
the hardest part is for people just to be honest, right?
Woo, woo.
And like I forget where I heard this. I wish I could take, but like you have no starting point if you don't have honesty, right? Like there you have no basis, you have no foundation. And so, I think one of the messages I try to preach is like, because I think athletes confuse it from there's a difference between communication and confrontation, and they think
Mhm.
that if they're honest that immediately jumps to confrontation, and I'm like, no, like that is the basis of quality communication, right? Now, tonality matters, body language matters, presentation, like all those things do matter, like how you go about wording, right? Words matter.
Right, right, right.
um but getting them to understand, and it's kind of, I think, same is where people struggle, even on like the spiritual side of things, of like, I like that. Would you say it's not condemning them, it's confronting them? Is that what you said? What was
Yeah,
the
in a way where it's like not condemning, but also not condoning. So
condoning?
you
Yeah.
live in this middle ground of like you want to make sure that you are, we want to build relationship with people, and I'm not saying like we have to try to like make friends with everybody. Like reality is that we may just not connect with everybody, and I think that's another part yet you have to accept in life, that that's just okay. That you might not connect, but I think um we can't be afraid. You said this earlier, we can't be afraid to like use our voices and like bring value to relationships or conversations in a way where we also are not afraid to like hold people accountable. A good friend of mine, man, he says this, he says accountability is care. And
Yeah.
we don't want to think of it that way, but it really is like, and it cares for us in a way that other things just might not be able to. So in love, you're holding people accountable. In love, you're helping people to keep their word and what they're saying.
Yeah, I like that too. I think that's hard for young adult, going back to the relationship side of things, is you can call it, whether it's intimate relationships or friendship relationships, is I had at same mentor, she told me is uh uh a relationship come apart, friendship come apart, where nothing bad had ever happened for almost a decade, right? And she was just like, Ryan, you're so hardwired to believe that all relationships are meant to last forever. And she's like,
Mm.
that's just not the case, right? Like,
Mhm.
and that's okay. And so, even when I talk to athletes, I'm like, are you still friends with people you're in fourth grade that you were in fourth grade with? They're like, no. I'm like, did they do anything bad to you? And they're like, no. And I was like, so why don't you call them? Right? Like, why'd you cut them off? And they're like, oh, okay. Like it starts to spin. It's like, it's okay. There are people in your life now that like you could just outgrow, right? Or like you don't share the same values anymore, or you don't see the world. I call it like you just don't see the world the same. Like you just have different perceptions of the world.
And I think that that's natural, you know? Like, I mean, there are things that we experience in our age, like you're saying, like fourth grade, but also in our stage of life. So it's like, how do we bring these ages and stages of like, I may be in a stage of life where I really want to have relationships and connect with people, but my age may not allow me to.
Yeah.
I may just be tired when I get home or whatever. I mean, like with the little one, your routine and your schedule is pretty like structured. You're just trying to structure their day and help them do what they need to do. But I think that natural separation, and I mean in counseling, and when you end a counseling session, it's actually called termination. You
Oh
actually
wow.
terminate from the client, which is a normal thing. So we teach clients to pretty much be okay with this relationship ending, and make it normal. And right, that's not a normal thing with us because, like you said, like we are very like optimistic. We want the utopia of this relationship is always going to be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
going to happen, and it may not be.
Yeah.
And I think that's the hard part to live with, and I have to come to grips with it too because like my disposition wants relationships and wants to be connected with everybody, and that's just not it's not reality, although I would like it to be. My wife jokes with me, she's like, you just connect, you just know everybody, we can't go anywhere without you saying hi to somebody and this and that, like why do you do these things? Like I'm like, I like connecting with people. It gives me life to be able to get to know who people are, beyond what we see.
Yeah, no, that's funny. Especially when we go to the grocery store. My mom or my wife's always like, I can hear you from across talking to somebody. Because I'm typically loud too.
Giving you crap, right? She's like, he just, or when they're in a conversation, you're trying to pull them away. You're like, oh, now look at you. Now you're doing
Yeah, 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 yeah. I love it. I love it. So how'd you get to Florida State? What's the what had I guess being in Tallahassee, moving there for school probably is a
Yeah, man. Wild story. Like I never imagined myself working in athletics, even as an athlete, like growing up. I did basketball, football, and track. And I was just all over the creation with like different things I wanted to do between music, between like arts, all of that. In athletics, I was kind of always involved. So when I got to Tallahassee, I went to school, studied journalism at FAMU, and I graduated. And I knew when I graduated, I just wanted to work within a college setting. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I still wanted to be around students, like who I wanted to be with, as opposed to like what I wanted to do.
right.
So I worked when I first graduated at ITT Tech, assisting the dean. It was like working in the literal office if you've ever watched the show. So
Yeah.
like my
Yeah,
boss
yeah.
exemplified all of that at the time. And about 2 or 3 years after being there was a position that opened up at FAMU in athletics as an academic advisor. And I was like, you know what? I feel like I can do at least 75% of this job. I don't have all the NCAA knowledge and bylaw background, but I feel like I can do this. So applied, didn't hear anything back. And 5 months later, I got a call asking, hey, are you still interested in this position? I was like, yeah, is it still open? So do the interview, winded up getting hired there, worked with probably 5 or 6 teams to start, about 230 some student athletes. I was there for about 3 years, loved my time there. And then in 2018, I saw another position open up at FSU, which was the same position, but just working with different sports.
Hmm.
So it was with women's basketball and swimming and diving. And the crazy part about this is like I was at a Christmas party with some friends and saw a commercial. This is before I had even like applied or knew the job was there, but it was a commercial that was FSU women's basketball. I
Oh
was like, man,
wow.
it would be so amazing to like work there and like, be there. And literally like months later, a position open to work with women's basketball. applied, did my interviews, a full day interview, and wound up getting the position back in 2018. And worked with women's basketball, swim and dive, and beach and indoor volleyball in my time here. And now get to work with all of our sports and student athlete development.
Yeah. So do you oversee all of them now?
So I work alongside my supervisor. So it's my director. I'm the assistant director. We have two interns, and yeah, we work with all of our student athletes now. So about 18 teams, I believe.
So how did you, the more conversations I have with just player development people and student athlete development, um the word that always gets tossed around is like programming, right? Like had to like learn how to like program for the thing, which when I think of program, I think of like strength and conditioning, right? Like we got to program this 12-week like workout. And so
Right.
like how did you come to acquire, develop that knowledge and just kind of like structure out your own thing? And I guess like what is your like what's your foundation? Like what are the main primary messages that like you want to get across? And I guess for example, it's like when I go in with the team, it's like how many of you guys like what's the number one emotion you feel? And like 99.9999% of the time it's either stress, worry, anxiety, or overwhelmed, right? And I was like, when you came to college, everyone told you this is going to be the time and they're like of my life. And I was like, here you are, freaking overwhelmed, like feel like you're drowning. And so it's like my goal for you is yes, we're going to help your performance. Yes, we're going to help all those things. But it's like, before we can do any of that, it's like, we got to feel human again.
Yes. Great.
So I guess for you, what's kind of that, like, what's that foundation for you as like you build and structure things out like for your athletes?
I think for me, when I think about all of it, it is cultural competency, and I think that's probably not the normal approach when it comes to development. But how can we prepare our student athletes to have the knowledge, the awareness, and the skills to go into this life and find their meaningful work and purpose in this world? And we do that by, identity exploration. We do like intentional aspects where they can explore and understand their intersectionality and how that impacts them. We do it by, preparing them obviously for career, professional development in other ways. But I think, like you're saying, it's so important for them to know who they are, to understand how they're feeling before they start thinking about any of those things, because all of that drives their decisions. And they're not thinking like, oh, yeah, like I'm not thinking about all the pieces of my identity, or I'm not thinking about like how I feel and if how I felt made me make that decision in that moment, like all those things come into play, like you're saying. And we really try to like have that as the foundation as far as what we do. So I think when I think about my own life, that is a lot of like what I experienced personally, and like trying to like dive deep and understand myself, the roots of my trauma, the roots of my patterns, my behaviors, because all of all of those things matter as well too. And I think these are just things that are not things that they think about. So I feel like my background experience kind of led up to like this point of like being able to help me understand. I was an RA on campus as well too in college, so
Yeah.
I've seen it almost all. But programming is, I think it's important, but I also think that there can be such a heavy emphasis on programming just to like meet a quota or meet like a criteria that
Yeah.
we miss the connection of really connecting deep with our student athletes by just putting on really good looking programs. So I try to not say like, how can we, yeah, of course we would like it to look good, but what is the substance? What are they really like gaining, and are we gauging them to see if this is what they actually want, or do we just think this is cool, and are we doing it because we think it's great and that they're going to enjoy it, and then they hate it because
Yeah.
we didn't actually like assess and see if they
Yeah.
want to do this.
Yeah. And I feel like there has to be like a level of like consistency within the message, right? Like you can't like bounce, you can't go like identity and then something else and then something else and then something else to where it's just
Right.
like there's no level. Cause I think of like there's three teams specifically. It's like I spend the entire season with them. And so it's like almost every time I'm in front of them, I'm like pulling it back to identity, pulling it back to identity. Yep. You see how this is identity? Yep. See how this is identity? It's like constantly like this constant reinforcement. Because if I come in and preach identity in the first month and then I don't say it again until month 5, they're like, I'm confused. Like, what are we talking about here? Right. And
Right,
so
right.
I think going back to like the programming thing is like how do we structure this as like, okay, what's our theme? For me, it's like identity, right? Like, and how do we constantly like tie this back? So like it's like just I'll tell them it's got to be here. It's got to be here over and over and over again.
It has to. They have to be able to see themselves. And the important part is for us, as we're seeing them, is to see them as they are and not as we are. Because
Yeah.
quite often we see them as we are, and then coaches, professionals, all these people start putting their expectations on their person as opposed to like seeing them as what their experience has been, what their worldview is, the value that they add in their perspectives. I think all those things matter, and in understanding like they just want to be seen with like a blank slate. They're like, man, you bringing all this extra stuff to me, but I want you to like see me and like see what's going on here. So I think, can help identify their blind spots. Like if you're driving, and you get over and you're like, "Ooh, I didn't see that car there." You get a little feeling in your heart, like, "Ooh, I'm glad that didn't turn into an accident." We
Yeah.
got blind spots, and I think we need a community that can help us understand those blind spots and see the gaps that may exist in our life.
How open-minded, putting you on the spot, how open-minded are like coaches within like what you're doing with them? Because I feel like that plays such an important role too, because it's if they're pre-framed like, hey guys, sorry, y'all gotta go to this thing like tonight, like, it doesn't do you guys any justice. I mean, it essentially sets you up for failure at some level,
Right.
right? Like, and so is I think that's important even when I have conversations with coaches, is like we have to have each other, right? Like there has to be backing here. It can't be like, all right, here comes Ryan again, and kind of yeah,
Yeah.
that type thing. So I'm curious of like how do you draw them in to make sure it like that they're kind of putting their stamp of approval, so to speak, on it, like, hey guys, like this is like actually important, like this is going to help you, because at the end of the day it's like most of them want to perform better, right? Like that's the ultimate. They're there for their job, i.e. play sport, right? And
Mhm.
so the judgment from them comes, are they doing their job, are they doing it well, that kind of type thing. And so again, for me it's like I have to like prove and lay out why identity will why, and they're like, okay, like there's error, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, like, okay, I'm gonna get better outcomes because of this. And so I guess like how do you approach that like with coaches too?
Yeah, we definitely try to build and have that touch point with coaches, whether it's like on a weekly and or biweekly basis to like let them know what's happening with our programming. I think they get, between seeing like the curriculum that we have, but also being able to sort through their points of confusion. I think that helps. I can't promise that they don't still maybe play it down,
Totally, totally.
There's that reality of like, oh, here comes student athlete development,
Yeah.
they're coming with the bells and whistles and all the other things, Yeah. But I do think that we try to let them know what's happening. We try to, get in front of them and let them know like the core and the pillars of our experiences that we try to provide. And I think that's what we try to shift our language to too, is like outside of programming, we try to share like we provide experiences. Um, as opposed to like events where student athletes can not only like insert their meaning but also get meaning from what they're attending when it comes to the experiences that we provide. But I think getting in front of them, having the conversation, is a big thing. For an example, we've been doing Seminole Heritage education, so really encouraging and educating our student athletes and staff about just the history of Native American tribes and indigenous tribes and people, and the importance of what that means to us. Like, what does it truly mean to be unconquered? We say it, that's a lot of what our symbols and slogans are, but like, what does that mean? So it's like the Seminole tribe was here. They lived here and they breathed. They went to war on these very lands that we're living on, and they fought and were pushed out of their land, and they continued to fight and build a resistance and a resilience. So it's like we share these things with coaches, is like that's a part of everything that we do. Like we are unconquered, really unconquered, because we get to live on a land that others fought for, so that we could be here. So
Yeah.
we try to instill that value, so that Seminole symbol means something different, when you look at it or when you understand the history behind it. So we really try to bring in that aspect of cultural competency. Like what's the cultural reference to all these things that we do? But what's the
Yeah.
history behind it? It's more than just a program, or it's more than just an experience. It's you getting the privilege to be here to honor and represent something that's bigger than you.
Yeah. No, that's actually super fascinating because that's like one like level deep layer deeper of because I always say like words matter, right? Especially like in athletics, we toss around like you need to be a better leader. I'm like, what's that mean? Right? Like you need to have better
What?
culture. Like, well, I don't know,
Right.
like right. And so it's like, even your own logo, right? Like to even just say like, hey, like we're the Seminoles, it's like great, like whatever, but like to really understand like what that actually means, like I mean, again, before we even hit record, right? It's like stories are what move people, right? And like that in and of itself, it's like, oh, like, okay, it's like now I can like have a sense of better pride about like what I'm doing here. There is a greater sense of like almost unity. It's like we are one. Like not everybody gets to wear this logo, right? Like this is ours. Like we get to like represent something unique and special. So I love that. That's fascinating.
It's wild, man. It's really, really wild. And it goes so far beyond like the history of Tallahassee. Like when you're able to look into the roots of like, marches that happened here, racism that occurred that still does, but like social justice, like all these aspects that let us be able to not only like be here and walk in it now, but also advocate and learn about it. And I think in any foundation, whether you're, working in athletics or anywhere else, if you can approach it with curiosity, that can help to build not only like confidence, but competence, and I
Yeah.
think we can have the confidence, but if we lack the competence behind it, then that confidence means nothing. You got this passion and this fire, but you're just out here burning folks, as opposed to like lighting something where they can actually follow a trail. So I think that's a big part of it as well, too.
Yeah, yeah. And oh, it goes back to I feel like a lot of that because we were talking about challenging beliefs and I think I
Mhm.
the word that comes to mind is just curiosity, right? Like I think that's one of the greatest gifts like any human can have is just being
Mm.
being wildly curious. I call it obnoxiously curious, right? Like
Yeah,
why,
yeah.
right? I know my wife, she's like, you're so judgy. I'm like, I'm not judging. Like, I'm genuinely curious. Like, why do you do that? Like, I'm just curious,
I
right?
just
Like,
want to know.
yeah. Um, but I think that ultimately builds that competency, right? Like is as we get curious of especially people that see the world differently than us, right? Like that's the only way to like understand. It doesn't mean that you 100% agree, but like there has to be some level of like okay, so like you see the world this way, but like tell me why and how that came about. Like that's the only way to understand to me.
That's it, man. And I think what you're saying, like, just the reality of the willingness to understand the that we have grand opportunity. It's literally like an oyster, if you will. Being able to like crack that open and understand like someone else's experience, perspective, worldview can change our lives completely if we are curious enough to
Right.
not condemn anyone in what they might share that could offend us.
Right.
you know, and the awareness to have that to say like, yo, like you might have just shared something that just threw me way off, but I want to still learn and listen about it. Um,
Well, that's the word I was going to use too. Use I it's listening, right? Like I think that a lot of people almost sometimes can be curious from an argumentative standpoint, right? It's like, let me ask this question to try to prove my point to you
mhm.
versus let me ask this question to like just actually just get an understanding and listening. It's like it's almost not saying anything after. It's just like, oh, okay. Like, right. And then it's like let that hamster wheel start spinning for a day or two, right?
Yeah. And I think you're so funny when you're saying that, it's just a reality of like most of the time it's out of a debate and most of the time it's out of a fact that we might feel like we know more than somebody else. So it comes from a place of like this mental assent where we have to just like, bruh, like say this and now you gave me more ammo for what I'm about to ask you. But I think when you come to this place of like, and it even makes me think of like our faith aspect in terms of like Jesus, and I think about like him saying like, hey, let he who has not sinned cast the first stone. This reality of like he put this gap in people's lives that were like, man, like, oh, I really got to think about this. It's like people are like, oh, I have sinned, I have messed up. I can't say anything, or like Sadducees trying to come with him with questions and say like, yo, like, like who's the first and to come in heaven or whatever it is. Like they're trying to bombard him with these silly things. And he's like, yo, I don't have time for your trivia. He really
Yeah.
gets to the heart of like what really matters. And I think for us as people, I think that's important too. And I think that that can't happen without curiosity. We can't engage with people at a level where they'll be willing to share and open up if we're not curious.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a coach, a high level Division 1 top 10 NCAA coach on the podcast. And so much as so is he was an assistant. And he said, as he was learning from the head coach, that when they have people on their trips, he's like, if they ask questions, like not a blanket statement, but like he was proving a point. It's like if they ask questions, like we want them, right? Like when they're on their trip here, it's like even something as simple as is like if we're just showing them like the weight room and the workout facility, it's not like, oh, cool, thanks. It's like, okay, so like what if they start to like be genuinely curious about like what they were showing them? He's like that's the people that we want because that personality trait is going to carry over, right? Like into
Wow.
their sport, right? It's like it's understanding kind of the why and the foundation of things. I was talking with somebody uh yesterday, and he was a college athlete and now in player development. And he was saying, he was like, man, like when I played, he's like, they always preach to me, understand the concept, understand the concept, understand the concept. He's like, I never understood what they meant. He's like,
Mm.
now I get it. So I'm trying to help these players understand. It's like, don't just run the play, understand the concept of the play, because now
Yes.
you understand everything behind it. Right.
Yes.
I think that that's like, again, layers, right? Like you can understand the play and you can understand the concept of it.
The concept is huge. And I think the concept in understanding the functionality of your teammates in that concept, like you can be basketball, you can be a point guard, but if you don't know how that shooting guard is going to move or operate, or if your other guards are going to come out and assist you in a certain way, then like you can be a great point guard, but you're probably not going to do a whole lot because
Right.
you don't know how your team operates. So I think, like you're saying, the concept in understanding the other roles and functionality of my teams, like understanding the play and all the pieces of the play, so that you can better approach it with an informed approach as opposed to like, man, like I just know mine. As long as I know mine, I'm good. But it's like, nah, you're not good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, that makes me think of um again going back to like the faith side of things is I was having a conversation with an athlete, and we like I shared that same story like with her, and she was and so I was like, like I'm just like I'm in this struggle because like yeah, like and like again you talk about curiosity and understanding concepts and then getting the hamster wheel spin and tying it all together. And she was like, well, Ryan, she's like, I feel like you're going to people to understand Jesus and God versus why don't you just go to God? Right. Like, and I was like, that's a damn valid point right there.
Like, let me
I
let
don't
me
really
find
have
something to
I
let me
don't
find
really have
something
an
to
answer. Yeah,
rebuttal
I don't
this.
really have an answer to that, right? But it was like that's like, but to me, like that's the concept, right? It's like you're trying to learn about God from everybody. You know all the plays, but like why don't you go to the source of it? Why don't you understand the concepts from it?
That's exactly
And and so I was like, like that's a really valid point. And I think that that's just a genuine way. And it's going back to like conversations too. It's like I think that that's how drama and things get started. Is like we can't go to the source,
right.
right, of things. It's like I got to go to a buddy and be like, what well they said da, 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 like versus just going to them and like, bro, did you say this? Like because I'm not okay with that.
It's wild, man. Like, and I think there's going back to earlier what you said, this just so key, the unworthiness, right? There is a layer that we carry where there's this unworthiness, there's this aspect of like saturation. It's like standing in a line at Disney World or something like that, or a fair where you're like, oh, my turn's gonna come soon, but this line is long, like
Yeah.
everyone's here, it's saturated, am I really like worthy to be here, with everyone else being here? And I think we often like battle the significance of like, should we, is this where we're supposed to be? So it's like we don't go to the source because there's this unworthiness, but there's also this shame. We can go back to Genesis 3, and Genesis 1, where Adam and Eve hide because of shame, and there's this idea of like there's a fear where we don't want to approach the source. The source is looking for us. He's like, "Where are you?" And
Yeah.
not in the sense of like even physically asking where are you, but asking where are you in a sense of like, where's your heart? Where are you and your motives and intent? Where are you? So I think understanding like the source is okay, that it's like a scar. You might get hurt for a little bit and it's going to hurt initially, but it'll heal up, and we'll be able to look back at it and say like, man, like that hurt, but like glad I went through that, that I went to the source.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and like as human beings, it's like an unfortunate trait that we have. It's like that we have to hit rock bottom before we make the change, right? Like we don't have to, but we feel like we have to.
Right. Why
And
should it take that? But it's just our reality. Like we are usually going to the source as a last resort as opposed to like the first place that we run to. And it's like you said, you have to go through every calamity that you could possibly imagine and finally get to the ends of your own independence, your self-reliance. You get to the end of your self-reliance and you got nothing left. You're like, oh, I guess I'll go to the source, now.
yeah, and I think too, it's like again, going another layer deeper is like I feel like oftentimes we're so dependent on, I call it like the outer you. There's two yous. Like there's the outer you, the physical you, and there's the inner you, kind of like where your heart is and things like that. And I feel like oftentimes we're just so dependent on the outer us, right? The physical us, the grind to shine, that we got to do all the
Mm.
work. We got to like, you're not an entrepreneur if you don't stay up 20 hours a day, right? Like that just like literally kill you mentality type thing,
Mm.
versus at some level it's like, okay, there has to be there has to be a better way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or a different way. And I think that's where all of a sudden we go inner and start to like, okay, like where's my heart? Like you said, is like when you were in college and a musician, right? It's like the question of like, who am I? Am I doing things that actually like internally fulfill me or externally fulfill me, right? Because it looks cool. I'm in, the Dream 100 band, right? Like all the
Right.
things, right? It's like I've got the status, the fame, the notoriety. Um, but inside we're being eaten alive. And I feel like that's where so many people live, especially like I think that's why I'm so drawn to like college athletics. It's like that 18 to 22 range. Like that's such pivotal years to where it's like you're starting to really actually answer those questions, right? Because you feel like, okay, like I need something else versus like just talent, skill, and ability that got me to this point.
I'm telling you, you're hitting right on it. Just this reality of like we rely so heavily on it because we've been so used to like being performative. Like it's performance. It's an unspoken competition that everyone is like we're competing against each other, but we don't really want to say it.
Yeah,
We are we are comparing ourselves and not seeing the worth and value that we bring in and of it. And all in all, it's just removing our authenticity, to where we get ideas like imposter syndrome and other things like that, to where people can't even feel like they can be themselves in a space where they're actually supposed to be.
right. Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah. Well, and I think too, it's talking about like the comparison thing is because in a lot of conversations like that's a big hurdle for especially again college athletes is comparing, oh well, my teammates doing X, Y, and Z, or this team and this person they're doing X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, but like right now, who are you and where do you want to be? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, well then like that's the only thing we should compare to, right? Like
Mm,
we like create the greatest future version self, and like now we have a gap and let's plug in that gap to get to that, because that's the only thing we need to compare to is just you. But if you're comparing to like, I don't know that like you would 100% just trade for where you are to be like with them. It looks great like externally, but like you haven't even taken the time to define, it's two worlds, right? You haven't even taken the define what that other world looks like, so you don't even know yet. Like,
mm,
and that's the work that you have to do, right? It's not the extra sprints. It's like, who's the person that you actually want to be? And then like now wake up every day and at the end of the day go, did I live as that person or did I not? Like that's the basis of life.
Finality, man. I think we are so driven by the primary gifts and skills that we've been given, and it doesn't allow us to really unearth and go deeper in the way that we should, like you said, where, if my one of my student athletes is always saying this, she's like, I'm now performing for an audience of one as opposed to an audience of many, and this audience of one is like God and myself, but it's just not this reality of like I'm not trying to meet the expectation of fans or any other places, but I'm competing against myself, more than anything. And it's just so important to understand like our intent and the heart behind what we do, because when we really get honest and when we really get like deep into it, it's usually jacked up. It's usually some aspect of our brokenness or our experiences that cause us to make the decisions that we do, and we are not able to reconcile and like deeper understand those things. So it just we wind up messing things up, even if we try not to, and then we look like this. We're trying to like gather all the mess, going on.
Yeah. And it again, it's a world of chaos, right?
It
Like you're
is.
constantly bouncing from one thing to the next, and you spend more time trying to repair things versus grow things, And it's like to me is one of the athletes asked me like about a year and a half in. And she was just like, Ryan, like, when does it end? And I was like, it doesn't. Like, that's the basis of life is to continue to grow because as you become more, you become have this reality of, oh, I'm even more deserving than I thought. I'm even more worthy than I thought. And like that's the reason for living, right? It's like to continue. It's like, and so she was just like almost frustrated because it was like she wanted this finite end of like no, but like I heard he's in the business space, but I heard he say he's like, there's certain games in life that you don't win. He's like, you don't try to win at marriage, right? Like, there's no like ending point, like I won, right? Like
Right.
within health, right? Like you don't like work out for like 2 years straight and then go, okay, I won, right? And it's over. It's like you continue to play those games and learn how to become more healthy and learn how to grow your marriage even more and build relationships even more. And so I think of understanding that there's not this definite moment of like, I made it. It's to continue to expand and grow.
I think you're so right. And the funny part about it is that the idea of winning when we win is actually really like deficit based here because it's limited. Like you could win, but the finish line is like still moving. So you may have won in a certain area, but like this thought of like I won this or did this, it's actually very like fleeting, So it's like in a place where we desire to be and to look or to appear a certain way. And more so it's like, yo, like there's a lot of deficiency here, as opposed to like what you're saying, where we can actually expand. How can we start in a place where it's small? And I've heard it said like, when someone does a big event, it's great. It's wonderful. It looks great. You got the balloons, fireworks, people are playing loud music, all that stuff. It's great. But at the end of it, it fizzles down into nothing to where you see
Yeah.
trash everywhere and just a couple of people that are there helping to clean up. But when you have a movement, you have a movement that starts really small and it continues to expand. You look at the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many other civil rights activists. It started as something small. It didn't start something big, but now it's impacted our entire world to the point where it's still going. People are still aware. It hasn't fizzled down to a point where people are just trying to pick up trash at the end of an event.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And it's the try not to use a buzzword because like everyone wants to call it like a legacy, right? But
Yeah,
like at the
yeah.
end of the day, it's like, how did you do something so spectacular that was like it was beyond you, right? Like
Mm, mm.
I think that's like because I've even asked athletes, it's like they're like, I want the thing, I want the thing, I want the thing. I'm like, okay. I'm like, there's a wall of like Hall of Famers, national champs, like whatever it is. I'm like, how many people that you did not share a team with here can you name
Mm.
out there? And like 99%, it's like maybe one if they're lucky. And I'm like, look, they achieved more than anybody at this university, and you don't even remember their name. So if you win, I'm like, tough reality. If you win, they're not going to remember you. And if you lose, they're not going to remember you. So just be the person, right? Like enjoy
Yeah.
it. And I think that that's kind of like you're talking about like Dr. King. It's like create this legacy to whereas something beyond you, it wasn't the winning the thing that everyone will speak your name for decades.
That's right, man. That's so powerful. And shout out to my pastor, but also good friend Adrian Crawford. He always says we need to move from moments to movements. You
I
know,
like
we
that.
go
Yeah.
from moments to movements, and how can we make this moment a movement? You know, in what we're doing. So, what you said, he says this too. It always makes me laugh. He says, you know, like your story, it has everything to do with you, but nothing to do with you. You know,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's about others. You know, this reality of like community and the importance of the impact that is beyond you. So, like you said, you just do it. You just be the person who you were created to be and focus on what you can focus on. You know, you can't control the future, but you also cannot change your past. So you like, although we try to, you know, it's just learning to be present, you know, in this current time and in whatever wherever it looks like, being present and understanding ourselves.
Yeah. And I think too, it's you said earlier because we were talking about like all relationships aren't meant to last forever. And but I will say this is it may not be the Dr. King movement, but I will say there will be a number. It may be one, it may be 10, it may be 100, it may be 1,000 of people that will forever remember you and like what you're
Mm,
doing there. You know, it's like I think sometimes we see the Mandelas, the Dr. Kings that like shifted a generation, right? And it's like we feel like if we can't do that, then we didn't live up to like expectations versus somebody asked me on the podcast one time, it's like, who's the most like right off the bat? They're like, who's the most like influential coach that you've ever had? Right. And I just named it. And he's like, you'll remember that person for forever. I was like, damn, that is actually pretty powerful. Right. So it's
mm,
like we'll have those people. Again, it may be one, it may be five, it may be 10, but
right.
like 30 years from now, they'll like talk about you of like, yeah, like, man, they like asked me this stupid question about who I was. And like I thought it was the dumbest thing ever, but like it stuck with me. And like I've constantly been on this rabbit hole, right? It's like we'll have those people for sure.
Sat with you. You always do, you know, and you have those things that people say that just coaches especially, you know, I can think about that as well too. I had a coach, Coach Baker, while I was in high school, and dude was wild. He was absolutely wild. Like, I mean, he would say some off the wall stuff. He'd be like, "Damn, better get them reps, Tillman. I tie a knot in your butthole." I'm like, "What? Tie a knot in my butthole?" Like, how would that even like? I can't even like begin to comprehend how that would even
Right, right, right.
he'd say some crazy stuff, but he really cared about us, you know, like, and it was hard to see the care, but his care was through trying to hold us accountable and trying to
Yeah.
be real with us. And we were just not in a place. We were too afraid to be like real, you know, because it was the fear of like losing others. That's that like we lose relationships sometimes when we're real or when we are honest. And I'm not saying honest to like try to like beat people over the head or like just I need to say something belligerent, but I'm honest in a way of like you can express how you feel
Yep.
and you can say it in a way that it's conducive. You know, it's you're not trying to break somebody down, but how can we how can we build each other up
Yeah.
by through being honest?
Yeah, you genuinely feel like it's going to help them, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
always necessarily, but it's like, again, going back to like your heart, right? Like it's well intended.
Yeah.
I think so. Last question. All right. If you're in a stadium with 100,000 people and you could only leave them with one message, what would it be?
Mm. Wow. I've been saying this a lot, and this is actually a quote from Transformers. Um,
Okay. I can get down with it. Yeah.
yeah. Optimus Prime says this to Shia LaBeouf in a moment where he's feel like the world is on his shoulders and he doesn't know what to do and what his purpose is and why he had even gotten chosen to lead this effort or even be with the Transformers. And Optimus looks down at him and he's like, fate rarely calls upon you at a moment of your own choosing.
Mhm.
And when we are called to a purpose, when we're called to something greater than us, it's usually not our choice. It's usually not something that we make upon our own, but because of what we've been given and because of how we've been made, we're uniquely designed for whatever work and whatever place we've been put in. So I hold on to that a lot. I would leave them with that.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of too, it's I always say like your passion's not found, it's developed. And it's like
Mm,
you start something thinking like this is gonna be the thing, and then like 2 years later, you're just like, how did I get here? Um, because you're
right.
just like grown and developed into. I mean, now working with like college athletes across the country 12 years ago, it started as a strength and conditioning gym in my parents' basement. I would have never thought and imagined I'd be doing what I'm doing now. And so it's
Yeah.
like, I think oftentimes it's like we think that we go on this like sabbatical to like find our passion, right? I'm like, I don't know that that's how it comes.
Nah, man, it's not, and it's put into practice, it's written down, and it's developed, right? Like, everything has to be nourished, but it also has to grow, and we don't just, like, fall into a purpose or fall
Yeah,
into, like fall into where we're supposed to be, like, we have intentionally been making decisions throughout our entire life toward wherever we're at. We just don't wanna look at that as, like, these have been the patterns and behaviors that we've shown, and that's why we are where we are,
yeah.
or why how we are, what we are too.
I love it, man. I love it. Well, again, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate all the stories, the insights. Until next time, everybody. Peace.
Appreciate you, Ryan. See you, bro.